1066, as everybody knows, the Normans invaded England. That most engaging of all medieval sources, the Bayeux Tapestry, shows them landing their horses at Pevensey in Sussex and racing to occupy nearby Hastings, from where they will shortly set out to fight the most famous battle in English history. Before that, however, they pause to have an elaborate sit-down meal. Barbecued chicken is on the menu, and attend that to their own protection. This man, says the caption above an important-looking Norman, shown above. Let's have a look. So this is the Bayeux Tapestry. I guess the man in question is here. Men of William the Conqueror's invading army construct a castle at Hastings in this scene from the Bayeux Tapestry. Here's the castle. It almost looks like they're playing hockey, but I think this is a spade. They're actually digging. So, it says, this man, says the caption above an important-looking Norman, holding a banner. Yeah, so it's definitely this image. Orders a castle to be dug at Hastings, and to his right we see a group of men with picks and shovels setting out to do just that. The Normans' decision to erect a castle at the very moment of their arrival might not strike us as particularly remarkable after all. Medieval warfare revolved around the building and besieging of fortresses, and the English landscape of today is literally studded with their remains. But at the time of the invasion in late September 1066, the Normans' action was startlingly novel, for prior to that point, castles had been virtually unknown in England. The only exception was a handful constructed a few years earlier by the French friends of King Edward the Confessor. The foreigners had built a castle in Herefordshire, says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for 1051, and had inflicted every possible injury and insult upon the king's men in those parts. The fact that he was reporting a new phenomenon is conveyed not only by the chronicler's palpable outrage at the Frenchman's behaviour, but also by his need to borrow their word residences, so as to emphasise a continuity of lordship. But in most cases, such continuity was lacking because the process of conquest had caused the country's existing tenorial map to be torn up. Sussex, for example, was sliced up into half a dozen new lordships known locally as rapes, which paid no heed to earlier patterns of ownership. New lordship required new castles, and the rapes were named in each case after the fortresses that sprung up at Chichester, Hastings, Bramber, Arundel, Lewes, and Pevensey. The reorganisation of Sussex into continual style, castle-centred lordships seems to have been a decision determined by cold military logic. The county had been the Normans' beachhead and also the former Godwine heartland. The rapes run north-south and their castles are all located near the coast, as if to keep the route between London and Normandy secure. In recent decades, however, the scholarly trend has been to emphasise the castles had other roles beyond the military. The fact that they were often sited so as to command road and river routes, for example, meant that their owners were also well placed to control trade and could both protect and exploit mercantile traffic. We are also reminded that part of the reason for building a castle could be symbolic. A great fortress, towering above everything else for miles around, provided a constant physical reminder of its owner's power, a permanent assertion of his right to rule. During the Conqueror's reign, this was most obviously true in the case of the three great stone towers the king himself is known to have created at Chepstow, Colchester, and most famously London. In each case, these giant buildings, the like of which England had not seen since the time of the Romans, have strong Roman resonances and were partially constructed using the stone from nearby Roman ruins. Not for nothing did 20th century scholars christen the style Romanesque. Indeed, in the case of Colchester, it is difficult to suggest a reason for the construction of so massive a building beyond a desire to be associated with the town's imperial past. There are no reports of rebellions or military action in Essex during William's reign, but the great tower he created in Colchester was erected on the ruins of the town's Roman temple. The Conqueror's sycophantic biographer, William of Poitiers, draws frequent comparisons between the royal master and Julius Caesar. To judge from buildings like Chepstow, Colchester, and the Tower of London, it was a comparison that King himself was keen to cultivate. At the same time, we need to guard against hypercorrection. In recent years, it seems to me, the revisionist arguments about Norman castles have been pushed too far, to the extent that some historians now come close to arguing that they had almost no military function at all. Take, for example, the castle that William the Conqueror caused to be built at Exeter in 1068. Its original gatehouse still survives and has been judged defensively weak because it was originally entered at ground level. This may be so, but it takes a considerable leap to conclude from this, as one historian has done, that the whole castle was militarily ineffectual. Much of the site has now vanished, but it occupied an area of around 600 by 600 similar military purpose. The Conqueror's great stone tower at Chepstow, for instance, has been plausibly reinterpreted in recent years as an audience chamber where the king or his representatives could receive and overawe the native rulers of Wales. But the fact is, Chepstow Castle was still a formidable building, situated high on a cliff above the River Wye, and defended at each end by ditches cut deep into the rock. True, it does not bristle with arrow loops, turrets, and machicolations. But then no castle did in this period, because the technology of attack was primitive in comparison to what came later. Without the great stone-throwing machines known as trebuchets, there was not much an enemy at the gates could do beyond mounting a blockade and trying to starve a garrison into submission. The Durham Massacre. In these circumstances, a well-situated and well-stocked castle could be militarily decisive. In 1069, the people of Northumbria overran Durham, massacring its Norman garrison, which tried and failed to hold out in the hall of the local bishop. But when the Northumbrians attempted to take the town again in 1080, they failed because they were unable to take its new castle. One of the remarkable things about the Norman conquest was how quickly the rift between the English and the Normans was healed. Within a generation or two, it is possible to point to castles that did owe more to ideas of peaceful living than military deference. But in the years immediately after 1066, filled as they were with bloody rebellion and even bloodier repression, when a few thousand Normans lived among a population of 2 million English in the daily fear of violent death. In these circumstances, castles have to be regarded first and